Welcome to Tough Conversations with David Wood, where play meets depth. We help teams and high-performing leaders like you to master your tough conversations so you succeed in your career and in your life. When we avoid tough conversations, we stay small. Teams stay disengaged, conflicted, and ultimately end up quitting. When we lean in and master our tough conversations, they become the defining moments that literally shape our careers, our relationships, and our lives. So let's dive in and master your next tough conversation so you can be the leader that you would follow. Let's play.
So I'm going to go live because I like the warm-up. No.
La 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 la.
Welcome everybody to this episode where I interview Jason Gore of Newberg, Gore and Associates. Jason's been a friend of mine for about a year now. He's a colleague and a very brilliant man. We also have quite a few points in common, which you'll find out about in the interview. Our topic for today is people just aren't talking to each other. And what do we do about that? Both in the personal world and also in the corporate realm. Here are just some of the things we're going to cover in this really great interview. Why you need to override your instinct. Why Jason believes humanity is in trouble. Why and how people are conflict averse and how that gets us into trouble. How trying to preserve the relationship sabotages the relationship. Speak to somebody else first before you have that tough conversation so you can release charge. And why you should practice at work these tough conversations before you go and practice it at home. So I'm excited about this. Let's dive in. Welcome, viewers. Let me introduce this amazing man. Jason Gore is an executive coach at Newberg, Gore and Associates, specializing in leadership at high-growth startups. For over 20 years, Jason has led leadership programs in over 85 cities across 15 countries for the Fortune 500, the military, NASA, and even Burning Man. I'm actually jealous about your bio, Jason. This is really looking awesome. He's led leadership and change initiatives at Disney, Starbucks, ABC, Bombardier Aerospace, and a bunch of other huge name companies. He later taught negotiations at Harvard Law School as a TA. Now, Jason's also an adventurer. He flies antique open cockpit airplanes. He's a professional rafter and spends a lot of time in the mountains of South America. He didn't mention it here, but I also know he's a paragliding pilot. He's made many decisions with life and death consequences. So welcome, Jason Gore.
Mark, thank you so much. Appreciate it. One thing I want to say is I really only work with startups these days.
Okay.
I really love working with startup leaders, in part because of this very conversation. And I find that the young millennial startup companies that have kind of really recently grassrooted themselves are much more willing to have real conversations, and their leadership seems to grow faster than a lot of my old corporate clients.
Right. Good to know. All right. So startups is your main focus. And, I want to tell people how I met you. It was quite unusual. A friend put us in touch. I think it was Brian Bear. And I was traveling at the time around the world, and I found, so we met virtually, we're talking on the phone, and I found 4 points of connection with you. Do you remember what they were?
No, I don't.
No? 4, and it's very unusual to have 4 points of connection. Firstly, we're both coaches. That's not unusual. But then I find out you're a paragliding pilot. That's unusual.
Right. The piano piece.
And I fly too. Then you play piano. And then the fourth
You do
one,
as well.
I do as well. And the fourth one that we both do is improv. We both do theatrical improvisation, improv comedy. So I was like, wow, who is this guy? And we only met on the phone, and you invited me to stay in your house before we'd met face to face. You weren't even home. You're like, come and stay in my home. It's totally fine. And then I met you. You came home and we met.
Well, I learned that paraglider pilots, any pilots, have to be precise to stay alive.
Yeah.
given the technology that we have now. That technology is changing. But yeah, so, people that fly tend to be relatively precise.
That's a good point. And you mentioned in your bio that you've made many decisions with life and death consequences. And so I'm realizing right now in this moment that you and I both have a level of responsibility that we're able to stand in, because we do make decisions, split moment decisions, in which our lives really depend.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. And I imagine do you feel like that translates to coaching? Does that help you with when you're coaching executives?
I mean, I think it helps me with not freezing in the moment. I would say my main conditioned response to threat is a freeze response,
Right.
which, you know, in a context when you don't have a lot of time to make a decision is not the best response.
Yeah. That's right. Because no response is a response. It is a decision,
Yes.
right?
No, so it's being able to choose how to respond in the moment. I think really was learned through these high intensity situations, and to learn, the responses that aren't going to be appropriate. There's certain situations where, you're flying and, something's happening and you're losing altitude, for example, and the initial response is you want to pull up because you're losing altitude. But if you actually do that, you're going to end up dying because you're going to stall and hit the ground, right? It's like, no, you got to push down. You got to get some speed up, get the plane flying again.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm interested in that. And in fact, that's probably going to be another episode about overriding our natural instinct.
Yes.
You
I
know,
mean, in fact, I think that's actually appropriate for today, because I think that's the core of how to shift leaders and how to shift communication styles, is to override, to notice what the conditioned habit is or pattern is, learn it so that you can pause it before you even begin it, or at least pause it right when you're starting it. Like, I'm trying to pull up in the airplane. No, bad response.
wow.
Response that leads to death. Pause, make a new choice.
Yeah, you're right. It's exactly the same thing. Your instinct is, let's say, to defend. Someone says something that's critical, and the instinct is to be right, to defend, and it doesn't work very well.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to catch that instinct and use willpower to say, I'm going to do something different.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. So before we talk about how people aren't talking, what's your vision for the world? I think you're not a guy who just sits around watching cat videos on YouTube, is my sense of you. You seem to be up to a lot. So would you tell people what you see for the world and what your mission is?
I don't think the earth is in trouble. I think humanity's in trouble. And honestly, I think that this generation is going to do just fine. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to leave a very kind planet or hospitable place for our children, socially, in terms of the environment, in terms of the earth, in terms of the economies. I think we're leaving a lot of headaches and a lot of problems that are going to be more severe than any previous generation has faced. And, my goal is simply to try to minimize that, leave a good home for our children, and basically teach the next generation of leaders how to overcome some of the challenges that they're going to face by giving them the problem solving skills, the communication skills, and the leadership skills that if they have care and passion, they can make a difference.
So what I'm hearing here is better leaders, better planet.
Pretty much. I always say that, when you look at how to shift leadership on this planet, that there's a couple key things. One is ethics, and the other one is capabilities. I don't really know how to teach ethics. I'm learning more about that, how to get people to have higher states of consciousness by their choice, and help them open up their perspective, to see more, to feel more, to make choices that are more consistent and aligned with who they are. That's what I would call ethos, and ideally more consistent and aligned with what's best for society. I don't know exactly how to teach that. I think the best way to teach that is through parenting, and when people are young. But as people get older, what we can teach very easily is leadership capabilities and communication. how to take good intentions and a strong vision for the future and how to turn that into a project that you could execute and you could, inspire others and move a group of people in a cohesive way towards a shared goal.
So your ideal would be to get to people when they're kids, and the second best is let's do leadership training.
Yes, and there's a reason why I chose, younger leaders. And I think they have a higher capacity to shift the momentum on the planet. So, the vast majority of Newberg Gore's clients are first-time CEOs under 30 who have raised many millions of dollars to start their companies and are, usually in the 50 to 200 person range at this point and doubling in size every year, if not growing even faster than that. So they're, these up and coming stars. And what's really great is that the cultures of these companies are much more forthright. They're willing to have conversations, even though a lot of millennials and younger folks are conflict averse, as we all are. But they're much more willing to have the conversations, to grow, to intentionally choose the culture that they want to create for these companies and for their teams.
So they're more willing, but I think I've heard you say that people generally are not talking to each other in companies. But I think you were talking about on a video about you working with people working in a nuclear power plant, and you found yourself in there trying to help them with their problems. And what I thought I heard you say is they just weren't talking to each other. And what we did is we went in and we got them talking to each other, and everything got better. Now, is that true? Would you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's just in companies. I think that in family environments, in any environment, that, the vast majority of people, don't have authentic, transparent conversations with each other because either they didn't go well in the past, they're afraid to because of whatever outcomes, things could get worse, which there's always a chance of that. But you also prevent the likelihood of things getting better and really improving those relationships and improving what you could produce together. I'll go back a little bit further than the nuclear power plant, which is my very first consulting project out of college. And I'll go back to when my dad came home one Christmas and announced that we were going to Disney World. And this was our Christmas present. Now, there had been a long run up to this, and my brother didn't want to go to Disney World. He wanted to go to Disneyland in California because we had relatives there. And so what my dad was coming home for was to give a gift, and was super excited. He had arranged hotels and, special events and all sorts of things. He'd actually worked really hard to create a family outing. And we immediately started fighting, and it was just because the way that he announced the decision was very top down. The decision was already made. He didn't include us, right? And it created a lot of problems. And and later, when my mother got sick and eventually died, I watched how my family dealt with the choices of her healthcare. And literally, my family stopped talking to each other because of how problems were being solved around, in this case, a very intense situation. But literally, they stopped talking to each other because they did not know how to solve problems, and it destroyed their relationships. So, when we then enter the corporate world or enter our jobs, what we see is that the dysfunctional family environment that we come from, in my case, a group of people that do not know how to solve problems together, right? We go into the corporate world, and most people don't know how to solve problems together anyway. And so we tend to hold back. We tend to bring those dysfunctional patterns into the rest of our worlds, and frankly, into our new families, let alone our jobs. And so those affect those around us, and it affects how information flows and what can produce. So I'm happy to tell a really eye-opening story about 7 nuclear power plants back in the mid-90s. But I think it's just everywhere, David.
So I think what I heard in there is that people, not talking to each other creates conflict. And then when there is the conflict, they're still not really fully talking to each other about the conflict. I'm seeing
Yes.
two issues there.
Let me articulate that more. So let's say that you and I have an issue, right?
Which we have had in the past.
Of course, most friends have.
Yeah.
I always actually think that you really get to know your friends by how you navigate issues. And you really don't know if you got a good friend until you have a big issue.
Right.
And you learn how to navigate that together and through that. I just had a cleanup conversation last night over dinner with a colleague I've known for 15 years. And it was just enlightening. I could see how I was judging him and how something really small he was doing was really pissing me off. And, it didn't piss off a lot of other people, but it was really upsetting me. And so we got to really dig into that, and he ended up learning a lot, and I ended up learning a lot. But you got to look at okay, so let's say you and I have an issue, right? If I choose,
Wait, what's our issue?
you left my place a mess, which is not true, right?
That was our issue.
Well, you tried to clean it up.
Yeah. All right. So this is a real life issue. This happened. All right. All right. You felt that I could have done a much better job in taking care of the place, right?
Well, I got home, and there was like I literally walk into my kitchen barefoot, and there's crap all over my feet. There's cereal and seeds and spilled juice that's sticky. And I was like, WTF? Sweep the dang place up and, wipe up after your mess. And
I'm feeling embarrassed hearing this.
now our cleanup was basically you were in a rush and did your best on the way out the door, but you just didn't look at the floors.
And earlier you hired a cleaner to come, and I thought a cleaner was coming after I'd been there. So I didn't go and do a deep clean.
Interesting.
That was part of my side of it. But you were like, dude, this could be a lot better. So, all right. So we got this issue.
So the question is, do I bring it up or not?
Yeah.
Right. And most people, I think, say, something, hey, the floor is dirty. I'm not going to worry about it. Why bring it up? Because it's just going to make a relationship worse. It's going to add tension.
Going to cause problems. David's going to get defensive. He's going to get upset. He's going to call you a jerk.
And hey, last time 4 years ago when I tried to bring something up with it, David didn't handle it well. So I'm not going to even bring it up.
Right.
But then, 6 weeks later, you say, hey, can I come over earlier? Can I bring my dog over to the place? And all of a sudden I'm like, David, I'm not so sure. What ends up happening when we try to preserve the relationship and we don't talk about the issues is it tends to sabotage the relationship. Over time, it tends to create more distrust and it tends to build. And ultimately what I've seen is while we're trying to preserve the relationship by not having the conversation, we end up destroying the relationship.
I love that. I just wrote it down. Trying to preserve the relationship destroys the relationship.
Let's talk about that in a work context.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of managers, what they'll do is they'll see their low performers, and their low performers will be not doing a great job. They try to have conversations, they try to direct them, and it doesn't work. And so what happens? They stop giving the important projects to the low performers. Instead, they give it to their high performers. And what you see happen is, one, the high performers get pissed off because they're just getting piled on and they see the inequities of the team, right? And so it increases the likelihood that your high performers are going to be upset or leave. But then your low performers are also upset because they see and feel the distrust. They know that you're not trusting them, but they don't even know why. And then will point fingers at the manager of hey, manager's not giving me any feedback. They're not helping me win, right? And ultimately what you see is that relationship goes downhill, that the performance of the low performer actually goes downhill. But what makes matters worse is that they'll stay at the company longer as a low performer. Whereas if you have a conversation with them and talk about what's not working, either they're going to improve, or ultimately you're going to have enough data points to say, hey, this is not going to work long term, and to replace them. Now, it's a little painful to replace an employee, but everybody's going to be happier, right? The manager is going to be happier because they have a full team. The high performer is going to be happier because they have colleagues that they could work with. And at the end of the day, the low performer is probably going to be happier because they're going to find a new job that works for them. I would say 10 times out of 10, what I see is that the role wasn't going to work. And whether they move laterally inside of a company or they leave the company, that person is almost always better off. And they knew it. Like if I do a lot of exit interviews later on, they knew that it wasn't working and they're happier now than they would have been.
So there's a risk in bringing it up. You bring it up for this employee who's not doing the best job. There's a risk. They could get upset. Things could go off the rails. But I think what you're suggesting is that long term, you're going to profit. It'll be better. Even if it didn't look the way you think it's going to look, maybe the person ends up quitting. Ultimately, that's probably beneficial versus trying to preserve the relationship.
Usually, there's very rare cases where you got to manage a brilliant engineer that is irreplaceable, right? He knows about flight stack navigation systems in a way that no one else can, maybe 3 other people in the world.
Right.
Maybe you make slightly different choices for them. But even then, I think that there's always a way to talk about it. Let me just say that the how is important, David. If you just go and you dump your issues on someone, it's not necessarily going to produce the best result. Like we need to make a choice to have that conversation.
Before we get to how, and I do want to get to how.
I'm going to say this one thing. Let me just say the one thing, which is be soft on the person and hard on the problem. Right? There's never a reason to beat someone up. To look at the outcomes that you want together and do so in a collaborative way. Like I just want to name that is primary. So thanks for letting me interrupt you, David.
Sure, and I want you to expand on that. But on that last point, I had an insight while you were speaking. I realized that I've been an advocate for truth for a long time. I'm a big fan of the truth. I don't always know how it's going to go, but I have this belief, this bias that the truth should come out so that the universe could respond. And the way it just occurred to me hearing you speak is that the universe is an incredibly complex system. And let's just go down to a microcosm of a corporate team. It's a very complex system. If you hide the truth, then you're distorting what's happening. But if you speak the truth, it's like a feedback loop. Just, use engineering speak. It's a feedback loop so that the system can respond and adjust. And if you don't do it, you're distorting it, and you're going to pay down the track.
There's several words I don't use, and truth is one of them. I try not to use lie. I try not to use but. I try not to use trust. But I don't think there is a truth.
I agree with you at one level. And then I said to some philosophy person once, I said, why are you speaking about truth when there is no truth? And he said, yeah, but for us humans with like 7 or 8 holes and whatever, there's some stuff that's pretty consistent.
Yes.
That we can rely on. So, but you're right. You bring up a good point. When I speak my experience and my view of reality, then that's feedback that can go into the system and people can respond accordingly. Mm-hmm. If I don't do it, I'm trying to control it, and the mind is neurotic and isn't very good at controlling.
Well, when it comes to conflict resolution, I would say the number one missing skill is the ability to own your perception and the understanding and willingness to understand another person's world. Right. So one of the 4 key mistakes I see most executives make is that they don't take the time to understand each other's worlds, right? And before making a decision, before giving negative feedback, before doing the thing that they want to do, they tend to assume that their perception is accurate and that their memory is accurate. And I could show you hundreds of studies that clearly indicate otherwise.
And this is all humans, right? This is not just executives. We do this with our families. We do it with everyone. I found, I've been training in this for quite some time, and someone criticized me recently, and I was so triggered. It took 5 minutes for me to consider. Well, 5 minutes is probably pretty fast, but for me to consider their world.
Yes.
Like, wait, because I needed to defend myself. I was so strong. And after 5 minutes, and fortunately I didn't respond to the email,
Yeah.
right, in 5 minutes. And I
Yeah.
went, wait a minute, I've got no interest in her world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to like drag myself to consider how it might look from her point of view. It was incredible.
And the truth be told is at the 5 minute mark, you were not recovered, right? Epinephrine or adrenaline takes seconds to release into the bloodstream and into the neurochemical nature of the brain. It takes hours for that to be cleared from your synapses. So even though you think you're triggered, and you could look at Gottman studies on this, that when people say that they're actually ready to listen and balance, they're not. There's a reason that the old wives' advice is sleep on it, because what we literally see is it takes hours, 4 to 8 hours, if not overnight, to really get back on your feet and come from a centered place to have that conversation.
Wow.
So, don't have difficult conversations when you're upset.
Yeah. And that was true for me. It took 5 minutes to realize I wasn't considering.
Mhm.
It took another half an hour for me to go through everything in my head and to start to work out how did I really feel about things. And then it was 3 hours later I responded. Didn't share any of my world, just reflected her world. But boy, it took a lot to get there. And I'm thinking, if I've trained for 20 years in communication, and that's what it took me, how's the rest of the planet doing when they feel triggered or defensive?
Totally. It's interesting. I mean, so first of all, a couple things to say about that particular incident. If I was working with a client and I heard that, what I would say is, first of all, pick up the phone. Don't communicate back in email, right? When you have any sort of trust or damaged relationship issues, then better not to put things in writing, because it could be so easily misconstrued.
That sounds like good advice, and I want to challenge that. I've given people that advice too, and then I find that I chicken out often. How about counterpoint? I'm worried that the person's not going to listen. I'm worried that I won't get all my words right. I'm going to fumble around and maybe say the wrong thing. So what about the idea of like writing it down first, or an overture of some thoughts on email and then opening up to a live conversation? What do you think about that idea?
Well, totally recommend the first, is writing them down. In fact, what I generally have people do when I'm coaching them is I have them send me the email.
Yeah.
Capture their thoughts when they're upset, get them to someone else, not the party you're upset with, right? Include someone else in the conversation, because there's something about speaking it that releases some of the energy, and writing it that releases some of the energy.
That's awesome.
And then, David, to clean that up and use it as your talking points, right? And to translate that, because if we just talk it out, we're probably not going to cover everything we want to cover. We're probably not going to cover it in a way that works. We're probably not going to want to cover it in the order of things that we want, like to plan out the conversation. Now, I have a whole method beyond that of how to plan out a conversation, which is not hard. It's essentially to start in the start, have the middle, and have the ending. Put things in the proper order, but write out your thoughts first, and then pick up the phone, or then have an in-person conversation.
Yeah.
If you just write it out, it's like you don't get to have a dialogue like we're having right now, where you're like, hey, I can test that. Like, where we get to clean up, where actually what you just said, and you said, I disagree with that. I fully agree with what you just said, right? Is to write it out, right? And we could find the nuance of where we both agree.
Agreed. It takes a lot of courage.
It
right?
does. And a lot of emotional intelligence.
Yeah. Something I've been doing for a while, which seems to be working, is I'll create a video so that people can see my energy. They can see I'm not attacking them. They can hear my tone of voice like this. And I say, this is a beginning. I wanted to get my thoughts clear, and I might ask permission to send the video. And then I say, I want to hear what you've got to say. Would you like to talk about this live? And sometimes I'll do what you said. I'll send the video to a friend who's a coach and say, is this clean? What am I missing? And they'll spot stuff that I didn't see, like something could be a bit attacking or seen a bit, like that.
Yeah. So here, my recommendation there is if you're gonna send a communication, and David, I'm curious if you have a different opinion. Don't include content. Include context. Right. Hey, David, I would love to have a conversation with you. When I walked at home, I was upset with the condition of the house. Can we talk it over? Right. But I'm not going to say the floor was a mess and this was that. Like that, I'm giving you a heads up that I want to have a conversation. I want to surprise you. I'm giving you a sense of what the conversation is about.
Yeah.
And I'm doing it in a way that is friendly, that's collaborative, that's, hey, David, you're a dear friend. I don't want this to get in the way of our friendship.
Right. So listeners, if you've got an issue with someone, be soft, hard on the problem, soft on the person, ask for permission to have the conversation, maybe give them some context and have the conversation live, if at all possible, instead of putting it in writing. And also write it down first and run it past somebody. Let someone who's not in the situation read it, hear it, listen to it. One, you'll release charge in just speaking it out to that person. And secondly, they might spot some things you hadn't spotted, like, I think you're still judging. I think you might be attacking. Have you considered how it might be from their point of view? You can get a lot of clarity and reduce the chances of it being a train wreck and increase the chances of it going well.
Yeah. And I'll say this, David, practice at work. Work is actually the easier place to practice because you all have a common mission, right? There's this, right? Family environments, it's a little harder. There's a lot of emotional history. You're tied to these folks for life. Practice with friends, right? Practice at work. The family stuff, maybe get a third party to help you because the consequences are actually really high, even though there's often a lot of love there. But if in situations where there's broken trust or there's love that's withdrawn, maybe not practice there.
Great advice. Jason, where can people find out more about you and what you offer?
Well, NewbergGore.com is our publicly facing site. The tools are all developed by Saturn Leadership, but right now that's still in quiet mode. So if you go to NewbergGore.com and you go to the tools section, what you'll see is two things. You'll see a cube model for conflict, and that's designed for businesses and business individual contributors and leaders to have difficult conversations. It's a 4-step model, really self-explanatory. There's a template to prepare for the conversation, a little note that says, hey, this is what often will go wrong. Watch out for these pitfalls, and here's how to do it right for a whole variety of conversations. And then there's also a leadership self-test. So that would be under Neuberg, NEUBERG.com. Just go to the tools section on that site and you'll see a leadership self-test that could help you identify some of your blind spots and where you might want to improve.
Awesome. So listeners, go check out newberggore.com, check out the cube model for conflict and start talking more. Practice at work, practice with your friends, and work up to your family. Although it is holidays, so you might want to take on some of the smaller issues with your family over the holidays. I actually have a personal belief that it's better to bring it up badly because you'll probably get a second go and a third go at it versus not bringing it up at all. But with now what you've learned from Jason, you can do a much better job. Jason, thank you.
David, this has been a pleasure.
You've been listening to Tough Conversations with David Wood. Now it's action time. Mastering your tough conversations will have a major impact on your team, your company, and you as a high-performing executive or entrepreneur. If you're ready, request a discovery session with me at playforreal.life so we can transform your team, your company, and you. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would love you to help me spread this message of tough conversations in a very simple way. Just leave a public review at playforreal.life/podcast. and you may hear me read it out loud and thank you live on a future podcast. Now, let's play.